Welcome to Writers Talk, the podcast where writers talk about writing. I'm Christopher from Writers Write, and my co-host today is...
Oliver Fox.
Today we'll be talking about Star Wars, the Star Wars universe, and its creator, George Lucas, among other things. I can't imagine anyone doesn't know what Star Wars is, but if you don't, Star Wars was a 1970s original film by George Lucas, who also created Indiana Jones. That was the most popular movie of all time up until that point, although not the highest grossing film of all time, which I believe was The Sound of Music. It went on to spawn two additional sequels, a prequel trilogy, a sequel trilogy, and three, I believe, there's 3 or 2 other movies. I can't be sure at this point. And in addition to a couple of animated series, and now, of course, The Mandalorian, where Baby Yoda comes from.
Right. Who has recently been named. Is it Grogu? Is that right?
Grogu, I want to say.
Grogu, that's right. Yeah, it finally got a name. We'll see if it sticks, though, because I feel like the audiences have sort of spoken.
As Baby Yoda, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure Baby Yoda will continue to be called Baby Yoda, but your hardcore fan group will want to know his surname next, I suppose.
Absolutely.
And how he's related to actual Yoda.
Yeah, we shall see.
But I'm enjoying Mandalorian. I don't know about you, Oliver.
I have seen the first season and I've very much enjoyed it. At least the beginning and the end of the show. The middle third was a little harder for me to engage personally, and we can discuss that later if you'd like. So I haven't really gotten into the second season yet. I am excited because I've heard a lot of fantastic things from friends who I trust their opinion on the Star Wars universe. So they all seem to be very excited.
And I think with good reason, although, I mean, after some, should we say, disappointments in the film universe, maybe a cautious optimism is wisely applied to Star Wars at the moment. So maybe let's start with George Lucas and how he created Star Wars.
Absolutely.
So George Lucas started off as a somewhat experimental filmmaker in California. He grew up in Modesto. And he was from a solid middle-class family. He enjoyed race cars and being around that sort of scene, and photography and that sort of lifestyle.
Right.
And so his first movie was kind of a reflection of American street life. It was called American Graffiti. And it cannot be overstated how different from Star Wars it was.
Yeah.
It was kind of like an American French film in a way, just an experimental, moody, angsty, teenage kind of becoming of age story.
Right.
A coming of age story. And then a few years later, we get one of the most popcorn-friendly movies of all time, and the original Star Wars.
Well, and it's interesting because technically his first film, it was a student film. He actually was one of the
THX, yes.
Yeah, he was a part of a movement of filmmakers. Brian De Palma and Steven Spielberg and a few others who actually came out of film school. They were kind of the first generation out of film school. Up until that point, Hollywood had been run by corporations, and it was primarily about following trends, see what works, throw as much as you can at the wall and see what sticks. And this was the first group of filmmakers who really, I mean, it's not to say that there hadn't been artistic pioneers in the past who were really passionate about it as an art form, but they were experimenting. They were helping give the art form its shape. So they kind of were experimental by necessity. And then, a formula kind of came out of that. And now we have the first generation of people who are saying, well, how can we break out of that formula? How can we do something a little differently? So he was definitely, and if you watch THX 1138, it is absolutely an art film. And American Graffiti was kind of the other side of the coin. It was a polar opposite. Um, it was very accessible, at least for American audiences. It was very nostalgic. It was very goofy and cheesy. And THX is very self-serious and experimental. And it's almost as if he was trying either end of the spectrum and had decided to, okay, well, let's see what happens if I put these two things together. And sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, he wanted to be a serious author, I think, at some point. And he,
Okay. Yeah.
And he had sort of academic ambitions and
Right.
was very interested in the hero's journey as a formula
Right.
for creating.
And he was kind of the pioneer of that as well.
Yes, yeah, I would say so. But he also loved comic books.
Uh-huh.
And maybe, definitely that's what influenced the Star Wars sort of feel, I guess.
Yeah.
I think originally he said he wanted to make a Saturday morning serial about his Star Wars universe.
Yes. Well, and it was inspired by Saturday morning serials. Essentially, the main inspirations for this was pulps, comic books, and Flash Gordon, Buck Rogers. He wanted to create, a Saturday morning serial, but he also wanted it to have wanted it to be grounded in a mythical and fairy tale tradition. And the way that he kind of pitched it was, it is a, it's a fairy tale in space. And definitely, but in the style and tradition of, the Saturday morning serial. So he wanted it to have that deep psychological rooting in something that's, the world consciousness, but also something that's very accessible to young children. He said that it was a children's film, right?
Yes,
right out of the gate.
He's maintained that the entire time he was in control of Star Wars, that it's for the kids. And he's also said it's basically an Arthurian myth. You've got your farm boy who's destined for greatness. He's got a magic sword. There's a mysterious wizard who helps him out. He has to go and fight the evil big bad guy. And once the correct order of the galaxy is restored, everything's done and everything's neat and tidy again. That's the basic premise of Star Wars, or at least it was initially. That's the impression you get with that first movie, isn't it?
Right.
That Farm Boy discovers he has special powers. Obi-Wan Kenobi, the Jedi, his sort of Merlin character, comes in and tells him about his history, his father's history, which is another important aspect of it.
Right.
He then refuses to go on the journey, which is part of the hero's journey. Comes back and discovers his aunt and uncle have been killed and everything's been taken away from him. Decides therefore to go on the adventure. Encounters seemingly insurmountable odds, but manages to sort of transform into a more powerful version of himself and defeats the the dark forces, and then is rewarded at the end of that medal ceremony.
Right.
That's a complete narrative, very satisfying one.
Mm-hmm.
And it's surprisingly just not one that really existed in film up until that point.
Right. Well, definitely not during that period. That was, at least in American filmmaking at the time, the 70s is a very cynical period, which you wouldn't be able to tell from the rather saccharine music of disco. But in film, it was a much different scene. We had films like Chinatown, the few, let's see, I'm trying to think of some other good examples. But you get the gist of it. Movies that were very realistic, were very cynical, which were very open-ended, and oftentimes they featured anti-heroes or straight up villainous characters as the protagonists. Taxi Driver is another good example from that time, who, rather than have a triumph of spirit, they tend to devolve over the course of the film. And it was a very negative, very cynical time in movies.
I mean, yeah, it's sort of the generation after World War II ends has sort of grown up and is making
Yeah,
these these sort of films or thereabouts. And at the same time, Vietnam is happening in America.
right,
People seem to be going over to some weird foreign country to die for. They're not really sure what reason.
right.
A bunch of strange things is happening in politics at the same time. And yeah, it's a dark time. And
Yes,
Star Wars is a light-hearted reaction to that because people don't want the real world in their movies. Generally speaking, they want
right.
something better or worse, in
Yes.
my opinion.
And yet it was I think it was an aesthetic of a genuinely lived in world that allowed people to buy into Star Wars. I mean, there's so much going on in it that makes it the incredible feat that it is. But what separates it from all the other films at the time, even his own film prior to that, THX and things like Logan's Run, a lot of them have people wearing, silver jumpsuits or white jumpsuits or gray jumpsuits, but it's always jumpsuits. They have ridiculous hats and hairstyles. They all have these really sleek Art Deco spaceships that, are functionally
Yeah,
just make no sense.
it looked like the Simpsons, not the Simpsons,
Right.
The Jetsons. Sorry,
Yeah.
whereas Star Wars looks like the Simpsons.
Yeah. Right.
Um,
And but what he did was he created a dirty, gritty, lived-in universe. And yet, despite that, despite the fact that it was that kind of that happy medium between a universe that looked lived in, that looked grungy and dirty. I mean, he talked about how he wanted the ships to look very industrial. He wanted people to be able to see the bolts, to see that no, this is something built out of pragmatism, not aesthetic. Some sort of aesthetic goals. Because if you're talking about space travel, you're not worried about how you look. You're worried about getting from point A to point B.
and even beyond that, these people are treated as such a common occurrence. It's really just, it's just getting from A to B in the cheapest way possible for them.
Right.
I
Yes.
mean, they don't have lofty ambitions in mind here. They're,
No.
gotta get out to this planet to do some carpentry for some guys. Sort of
Right.
the feel,
Yeah, and that's another thing is Luke isn't he's not someone who builds spaceships. Yes, he tinkers with droids and stuff like that. Maybe he has at the grandest aspirations to build droids one day.
I mean,
But
the
he is
most technical thing we see him do is give one of the droids an oil bath. Right?
but he's a farm boy, and so by grounding this very fantastical premise and story in this very mundane presentation, and a lot of times very mundane characters and almost mundane settings. At least to begin with, a little sandy patch on a sandy planet. It's what helped people buy into it. It allowed them to
Yeah,
suspend
imagine,
their disbelief.
and they could imagine themselves in a similar position. It's very easy to
Absolutely.
imagine yourself in Luke's position.
Absolutely.
And
And the
the
only
world
things
around
that
him,
they, sorry, go ahead.
sorry, the world around him, even though it is maybe like, objectively terrifying, doesn't seem like a place you wouldn't necessarily want to be.
Sure.
It often seems exciting and fun, and there's interesting things to do. It's not. A lot of people complain about Star Trek that it seems, it's all well and good that there's no war or famine or poverty or anything like that, but it doesn't seem like there's anything to do on a weekend in the Star Trek universe.
Yeah.
But yeah, people are drinking in bars and gambling, and there's all sorts of underground activities that are going on around
Yeah.
them.
Yeah. No, I mean, we see that pretty clearly very early on when Luke kind of crosses the threshold and, he's in a cantina. Like that's his first real experience of the outside world. And it is, it's populated by some characters. And actually it's interesting. I was watching a documentary called Field of Dreams, or wait a minute, is that right? Star Wars, something of Dreams, Empire of Dreams. There we go. I don't know what I was thinking of. Empire of Dreams, and Luke. Sorry, not Luke. Mark Hamill playing Luke. When they first went into that scene, the cantina scene, he talked about how he was absolutely devastated. And George Lucas was devastated because they had been so on top of, creating these really unique costumes and makeup and everything for everything that they had filmed prior to that, which was set in North Africa, with the sand people and the Jawas. Is that what yeah. So suddenly they go in and they're in London in a sound theater, and they had just grabbed props and costumes from fairy tale productions. So they had like rat suits and a giant, what was it, praying mantis costume, and he said it looked like they were stepping into the Nutcracker.
They literally had a Dracula costume and
yeah.
A werewolf costume. Yeah.
Yeah, and it just did not match with the rest of the tone of the movie, and that feeling of no, this is a wholly unique universe. But so yeah, they were very big on creating that sense of this is a real lived-in world. This is not, this isn't a Aesop's fairy tale where we have talking mice for the sake of creating some sort of moral. Although they did call it a morality tale. So yeah, it's interesting the way they used that sense of grounding to build interest.
I think it could have really gone quite poorly, at those sort of junctures if the characters weren't compelling.
Yeah.
If the story wasn't so airtight.
Yeah.
And if the editing hadn't been quite so on point.
Oh, so yeah, the editing was essential.
One of the things, yeah, the editing. I think his wife was the editor at the time. George Lucas's then wife, not his current one. And reportedly, she saved the movie in the edit, which, if it is to believe, that the original sort of draft of it felt more like a space odyssey than what we ended up with. So,
right.
Thank God for her.
Well, so yeah, so it was actually three different editors that worked on it. She was the first kind of interim editor, who started to help get it on track. So George, when he watched the first cut of the film, actually when everybody watched the first cut of the film, they were devastated. The timing, the pacing, everything about it just felt so slow and dull. And actually, in that documentary I mentioned, they showed you some of the original cut of it, and it just absolutely dragged. And so his wife, who was she was working with, oh gosh, who was it? He's one of those big filmmakers. The guy who made, oh shoot, not Hearts of Darkness, but the film
Apocalypse Now?
document. Yes, Apocalypse Now.
I don't know.
His name is slipping my mind at the moment, which is horrible. But anyhow, she was working with him on some films and on a film, and she decided to sub in because George tried to talk some sense into the editor, and the editor was a very traditional editor. He used lots of master shots, didn't cut into any close-ups or anything like that. The master shots being just, a wide angle with no cuts, it doesn't get any closer, it doesn't jump around. So it was very, very slow. It wasn't very lively. So she jumps in and she starts working on it. But eventually she had to get back to the film that she was working on. She was kind of just doing it as a favor for him. And so he calls in two other editors, Richard Chu and Paul Hirsch. And these two guys, according to Lucas and to everybody else involved in the project, they really saved the film because they were able to bring it to life. They were, cutting not long after the characters had delivered their lines, and with these long, awkward pauses, they were jumping from thing to thing, and it completely changed the pacing of the film from shot to shot. And they sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, and I mean that whole livening up of the editing was crucial to it. I mean, it made it it turned it into this modern blockbuster style of film, although it seems like a very slow movie if you watch it today.
Yes.
But I don't believe that's the most critical thing that happened there. I think it's amazing that happened, and it's amazing that happened before John Williams became involved.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think the score of the movie, that classical music style score of Star Wars, that John Williams is absolutely famous for, as well as many other things like Superman, Indiana Jones, a number of other movies that you probably like as a soundtrack by him. And as soon as he put that, the Star Wars beats into place, it just gave that energy and life to that universe.
Absolutely. And that was a very odd choice for the time.
Especially classical music, yes. Most space shows would have had kind of ethereal electric instruments like the Star Trek theme, that kind of intro music they had. But yeah, that's probably what made Star Wars, I think. It's just that ridiculously good music.
When he actually showed many of his friends prior to the soundtrack being implemented, so the edits had been applied, and he got his Steven Spielberg and Brian De Palma and a few other filmmakers who were close friends of his. They all got together to watch a screening of it before they had applied the soundtrack, and all of his filmmaker friends say, "We don't get it. We don't know what you're trying to do. We don't think it's very good." The only exception being Steven Spielberg. He said, I see what you're going for, but it's not there yet. And conventionally, what would have been applied is, like you said, either an electronic soundtrack or, believe it or not, something sort of disco influenced, something that would have given it a completely different tone. And it was, he was striking out on his own here, as he had throughout the whole process of making the film, by choosing a classical soundtrack. That was not what the studio wanted at all, but it was what he wanted. And you're absolutely right. After the edit, the thing that the cast and crew all agreed was the thing that really brought it together was having that soundtrack. And obviously the special effects came later. They were able to get
Yeah,
all that
we
done.
must talk about that, because obviously the special effects were a huge part of Star Wars.
Mm-hmm.
And nothing had been quite as groundbreaking up to that point, in special effects, regardless of where you look, even Space Odyssey or other Star Trek,
Yeah.
anything really. That opening shot of the Star Destroyer coming over to the score of Darth Vader,
Mm-hmm.
breaking through the door, just gives this incredibly realistic feeling to that world.
Yeah.
Just this immense sort of presence of that giant ship in space, yet it feels weightless because it's gliding over.
Yeah.
You've got this music telling you how to feel about something. And then you have James Earl Jones' voice coming out, powerful and
Mm-hmm.
reverberating. You had Carrie Fisher in her British phase, delivering these sort of pompous lines,
Yeah.
which gradually throughout the series she becomes more and more American.
Right.
But maybe that was intentional. I'm not sure, but noticeable in the first movie at least. But
Yeah.
it all came together, and it made a simple story about a farm boy finding a magic sword into the greatest success story in narrative history, maybe,
Yeah.
is the way to put it.
No, I mean, it is really astonishing. I mean, right from the get-go, every aspect of his approach was of Lucas's approach to this movie was unconventional, was independent thinking. Um, he pitched it to Universal and Paramount. They both rejected it, and he was actually very relieved. Fox did not get it. They had one guy on the board of directors. I think it was Alan Ladd Jr., who said, "I don't believe in the film, but I believe in George, and I think that he can do something with this." And so he had just finished American Graffiti and hadn't been released yet. And it was only released just barely before Star Wars was. Actually, fun fact, prior to that, it being released, well, actually, let me keep on the track that I was going on. So that movie, American Graffiti, comes out, his first widely released film, and it's a hit. It's the third biggest box office smash of the year. He gets a lot of great attention for it. And they talk about giving him a raise because he was only paid $100,000 for that particular film. And so Alan Ladd Jr. approaches him and says, "Hey, we're talking about giving you this raise, and what do you want to do with that? Like, what do you want to negotiate?" And he said, "I don't want a raise. I don't want any more money. I just want all the merchandising rights." And they said,
"Yes, yeah.
What?" Because merchandising wasn't really a thing. So what he did, while he's making the movie, he goes and gets all these artists to start making, different like posters and T-shirts, and he starts marketing these at Comic-Con before the movie has even come out. And actually, a year before the movie comes out, he releases a novelization of the script. And so there was this built-in underground movement of sci-fi and fantasy fans, specifically from Comic-Con in America, who were primed and ready for this film to come out. They already knew the story. They already knew the characters. And even he got Marvel Comics to do a run of comic books before the movie comes out. So for a lot of these people, it was almost like, I mean, I imagine what it was like for me having grown up with Harry Potter and the movie finally comes out. You know, I had been waiting to see this realized, you know, with live actors, with beautiful sets and special effects. This was kind of the final evolution of that. So he, that's all he held on to was
Yeah,
the
and if you,
merchandising
and
rights.
just a note to anyone writing movies, I mean, it's always good to have your fans on board with you, even
Yeah,
before the release of a film. So
and
you
that's
can't
exactly what
hurt.
he did. He built a fan base because nobody else really believed in this. I mean, even the guy who was advocating for him, Alan Ladd Jr., was. I mean, he didn't really care for the story all that much at all. He was just interested in Lucas as a creator. But then from there, Lucas creates all these pioneering companies, from THX to Lucas Light and Sound to I mean, eventually, actually, Pixar was one of the ones that he created.
Yeah, although I think that might have come via Adobe, which a
Yeah,
friend of his created as well. As
yeah,
sort of as part of the whole what's it called? Industrial Light and Magic, right?
yeah,
That's
yeah.
the special effects company.
But it was all he created all these little companies because he wanted to be able to have as much creative control as possible. Even to the point where in the second film, they got this huge loan from the bank, $33 million, to fund this second film, and they're thinking that, you know, because the first one was such a smash, that they'll easily, you know, hold on to that. But the bank gets a new, I don't know, CEO or some sort of high up person, and they pull the loan. And he did not want to go back to Fox. He didn't want to create this within the studio system. He didn't want to work within Hollywood. So he said, you know what, I'm going to put up my own money. So he funds the film himself, which was crazy. I was able to get such a return on that investment. Not only did he make his money back, but he had a surplus of over $5 million, which he then invested back into all his cast and crew.
So
Uh,
I mean, let's not hop on about that too much. Just to give you an
yeah,
idea, though, the budget of Star Wars, the original Star Wars, was $11 million.
yeah,
It made $1.5 billion,
yeah,
I believe, adjusted for inflation. But yeah, yeah, that's what, three orders of magnitude, yeah, in terms of
yeah,
return.
yeah,
And you know that set him up to make whatever he wanted thereafter.
yeah,
He could basically dictate, you know, what he wanted for the next two movies, which are both very good.
uh-huh.
Although people complain that the narrative sort of suffered in Return of the Jedi a bit. Um,
Right.
and then he was reviled when he made his prequel trilogy,
Yeah. Uh,
which, if you believe him,
well,
is the most George Lucas of anything he's ever made. You know, completely what he wanted to do, no studio interference. He owned all of the parts of the business he could, except for the distribution, which was Fox. But
right,
it's not like they weren't going to, you know, release a Star Wars movie.
right.
So, you know, it was completely his baby at that point.
Yeah,
And a lot of people really, really hated it.
yeah.
I mean, what do you
Well,
think
so
that happened?
I think that so there's another great little documentary series called The Toys That Made Us. And there's a fantastic episode on Star Wars and the Star Wars toys. And I think that a lot of it, you know, essentially as the movies went on, so the first version of the script included all three movies. He cut the first third and made episode four. And then bought the rights to the following two films. But one of the things I think the merchandising success went to his head a little bit, and he realized that that was where he was making his money. Because for episodes 5 and 6, he allowed toy makers to dictate whole characters and ships and droids. They would create things that they thought would be compelling for kids, not necessarily something that would serve the story, and then he would write it into the script. Because he was trying to capture that demographic, which was the toy buying public.
And this all sort of culminates in the creation of the Jar Jar Binks character.
Yes, absolutely.
A lot of people see as a silly, redundant character. I mean, he does sort of push the plot through at points, but he doesn't feel necessary at all to the story.
No.
And there's complaints that he is a sort of, quasi-racist sort of stereotype.
Right.
And just in general distracts from the story. And I have to say, like, as a kid watching it, I kind of loved him.
Yes, I did too.
But anyone who was older than, what was I, like 13, maybe a bit younger, when I watched episode 1, hated it. They'd grown up with a much, much more serious version of Star Wars, and they'd read the novels, which were dark and gritty and bloody. And then suddenly you had, "Okie day, here comes Jar Jar Binks."
Yeah. I mean,
it's like having a Teletubby suddenly appear in Star Wars.
Yeah.
And you can justifiably see why people are angry at that.
Yeah, and I mean, and I think so. The prime example of him heading in that direction in episode 6 was the Ewoks. The Ewoks were 100% created as a merchandising opportunity. They were not there to serve the story.
Originally, they were supposed to be Wookiees, I think.
Yeah,
which is what Chewbacca is.
Right, they were shoehorned into the story. They weren't there to serve it. Once the merchandisers came up with them, and so they had there was a similar reaction with the original generation of Star Wars fans when the Ewoks show up. They were absolutely revolted by them. But again, kids liked them. And so he carried that lesson with him. And he said, well, I don't care if
adults think it's crap. This is for the kids, after all. That's what I've always said.
Yeah.
And to his credit, he kept it that way.
Absolutely.
But he did take it somewhat personally. And I think justifiably so, because there's a whole lot of people who took it far too far. People saying George Lucas raped my childhood by changing these.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
He went back and he changed a few things in the original series when special effects were better. The whole Han Solo shooting Greedo debacle. I don't know if you're aware of that.
First?
Originally, I think Han Solo shot Greedo, and then they changed it so Greedo shot first, to make Han Solo look reportedly a little bit better, I guess.
Yeah.
People went bananas about that. And there's a whole just bunch of attack on his personal character. People kept making fun of him, just for senseless things. I mean, there's perfectly reasonable critiques of the movies to be made. But ultimately, I think by the point, by about 2012, he was completely fed up with Star Wars. And he just wanted to get rid of it. And, Disney was sitting there, having made a huge bundle of cash off the Marvel universe. And Kathleen Kennedy, producer of E.T. and friend of both George Lucas and Steven Spielberg, I was like, well, you could sell it to us, and I pinky swear promise we won't do anything terrible with it. He has some undisclosed amount of money with some back end, and George Lucas was more than happy at that point to give it away.
Yeah. So it's funny, I actually have kind of a behind the scenes anecdote about that. So a family member of mine is a filmmaker.
Okay. I'm just going to jump in here quickly because I think this is going to be hard to edit together. A
Okay.
bird was trying to break into my room. So
Oh my
we
goodness.
have just paused briefly, but we're going to begin again.
Okay.
What were we talking about?
I was actually going to share, I think I've told you about it, the anecdote
An
about
anecdote. Yeah,
my,
yeah. Good.
my brother meeting George Lucas 2 years before he sold it off to Star Wars and actually kind of being
So
forcibly taken
just before
aside when,
Disney took it over, yeah?
yeah, and you know, um, Lucas was basically kind of muttering to himself and then grabbing whoever would come nearby to complain to them about everything and just how bitter he was. And my brother was one of those people, one of the people who indulged him the longest. And just yeah, it was kind of foreshadowing for what was to come that he eventually, the impression my brother got from him was that he was just absolutely devastated and bitter and was just ready to be done with it all and move along. And sure enough, 2 years later, that's exactly what he did.
Which personally, I miss his influence in Star Wars. I think
Yeah.
as much as people hated much as some people hated the prequel trilogy, I never for a moment didn't think it was, it didn't fit with the rest of the Star Wars universe.
Right.
It might have had a weird tone,
Mm-hmm.
but it felt certainly part of the same world.
Right.
I don't know if you have any.
Yeah. So I actually, after the recent trilogy came out, I was, kind of devastated the way that the generation that had grown up with Star Wars was when the trilogy, the prequel trilogy came out that I absolutely adored at the time, being about 11 years old.
I look
I'm willing
forward
to.
to a podcast 15 years from now where some people are saying, isn't it weird how people already hated the Disney trilogy compared
Yeah,
to
nah,
compared to the Universal trilogy that came out?
right.
Yeah.
I'm sure that it's very possible that that could happen. So um, my
So,
fiance and I decided.
yeah, go.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, no,
We
no, go ahead.
decided to go. We decided to go back and watch the entire series all the way through in chronological order, and just as objectively as possible, analyze it. And we watched the prequel trilogy, and we were not upset by it, or not as upset by it anymore. And partly that was probably nostalgia, seeing it through a lens of like this was the Star Wars that I grew up with coming out. I mean, I had seen the original trilogy a million times before episodes 1 through 3, and actually, I just remembered this. I had seen episodes 1 and 2, but I had never actually seen episode 3 because I was so. Episode 2, I actually did not like. I did not. I couldn't stand the Clone Wars, and so when episode 3 came out, I said I'm just going to skip it. So this was actually the first time I had seen episode 3. It was the first time I had seen that full prequel arc, and all in all, I
Yeah,
was.
many people do hate Attack of the Clones. That's the
Yeah, I was. I
second
was.
chronological movie.
Yeah, I was pleasantly surprised by the third one and just the overall feel that I got from all three of those. Uh, it it definitely felt um, like it was in the Star Wars universe. It didn't feel like it was a wholly different thing. I think where it went wrong in a lot of ways was this weird tonal shift and just subject shift in subject matter where the story proper is all intergalactic politics and trade disputes, which just went over my head as a child. I was just there for the duel of the fates, that fantastic lightsaber fight between Obi-Wan and
Darth
Qui-Gon
Maul.
Jinn and
Yeah.
Darth Maul, fantastic fight scene. I was there for that and pod racing and all that sort of stuff, but the actual story just did not connect with me. And I think in large part he was trying to have his cake and eat it too with, he's putting in these ridiculous characters who are clearly just cynical merchandising opportunities like Jar Jar Binks, but he's also trying to appeal to more adult audiences by including quote unquote serious subject matter, which
I feel sorry for him because you can see he's listened to criticism
yeah,
from the Return of the Jedi. It's too silly. It's too childlike. So
yeah,
he's included this Roman Republic style political plot line,
yeah,
and then people have gone, "This is too serious. What's not
yeah,
Star Wars?"
yeah.
So
It's too serious and too silly
at the same time,
all at
it's
once. Yeah,
but as you said, I don't find anything objectable about it in an emotional sense.
no,
I find Jar Jar Binks does stupid things and acts
yeah,
in character and gets his comeuppance, and it's perfectly appropriate to that character.
sure.
Serious characters have serious things happen to them,
Hmm.
um, and it's perfectly in character with everything else that is happening around them.
Yeah,
There's dark bits that feel earned, and also some lighthearted bits that feel silly, but appropriate for the tone of the movie.
yeah.
Uh,
I
but
mean,
but yeah, and then we move on to the Disney era Star Wars, I suppose.
mhm.
That comes after that, and I don't know how you felt about it. I really liked the first one.
Yeah.
I and then everything they made after that, I didn't.
Um, yeah. So I enjoyed the first one at a superficial level for sure, and even the third one at a superficial level, and to a lesser degree. And then
No, I'd agree with that as well. I felt there was a certain sense of relief in the third one.
absolutely. Now, subsequent viewings of all the movies, I find there's bits and pieces that I can look at and enjoy. So, for instance, there's a fantastic YouTube channel that I love to keep up with. It's a group of guys who do little video essays about film, and they have two episodes that they do that are just an appreciation of Star Wars. They just take all the most beautiful shots from all the movies, and actually quite a few of them are from the recent trilogy. And I remember after seeing that, I had a slightly lighter approach to those trilogies, because even if story wise, it's prizing canon over continuity. So we have things that were not established in earlier films that even contradicts earlier films. But it's canonical because it's there. Even with all those problems, they are pleasurable films to experience, just to watch, to kind of at a visual level, at a
Certainly, there's some spectacular shots in
yeah.
all of those movies.
So I was able to kind of redeem it from that perspective in my own mind. But I the first one, I was like, okay, well that was a nice little nostalgia trip, nice little
Force
rehash
Awakens
of
has exactly the same story as the original Star Wars.
yeah, exactly. There was nothing new there. It was just J.J. Abrams doing his
Yeah,
little
so
fan service.
instead of Luke Skywalker, we have Rey, no surname,
Mm-hmm.
comes from a desert planet, is a no one, gets some Jedi powers, ends with them blowing up a giant space sphere that destroys planets.
Yeah.
Essentially, exactly the same story.
Yeah, and also frustratingly, at least to me, the stakes were too high right out of the gate, because we don't just have a something that destroys one planet, we see
Oh, it
literally
destroys an
what.
entire solar system.
Yeah, and so it's hard to go anywhere from there. I mean,
I mean,
emotionally the stakes are too
yeah,
high.
it's a problem imagining that sort of scale of tragedy.
Yes,
And
and that's a
people are
great point.
very, it's very easy to imagine how devastated John Wick is at the loss of his favorite puppy.
Right.
It's difficult to imagine how Princess Leia felt when her planet blew up, I suppose. It's
Well, and so that's
impossible, but I mean, but you can do it. But it's
yeah,
impossible to empathize with the destruction of entire civilization that you've had no interaction with.
right, and that's a common problem in storytelling, and actually in specifically in one that's highlighted in news media. So I've read I've tried to read craft books from every area of writing, and one of the ones on journalism and writing news, they talk about this problem of you can't if you list numbers of people of casualties of people who've died, even if it's in the thousands and tens of thousands, people don't respond to it emotionally because you're exactly right. They can't wrap their mind around it. They have no connection to it. However, if you tell the story of one person who's affected by this larger global event, it will engage people much more. And with the destruction of Leia's planet, even though it's something that's on a scale that we can't imagine, because we can understand her hurt, we can kind of get it, and so it's meaningful to us.
Although it must be
But when
said, the Skywalkers seem to be a family of sociopaths that get at the loss very quickly.
right, oh yes, absolutely. Um, but when we, and I think a large part of that is just the pacing. You know, they're trying to keep the story going. Um, you can't have long meditative scenes of her staring out the window, worrying about her planet. There's too many things to cover. Um, anyhow, so but with that first film in the new trilogy, it all I felt nothing. I mean, we see briefly people, you know, on the planets themselves looking up, but we have no emotional connection to them. And before they're, you know, annihilated essentially. But it's so much, so quick that it's too much to process, and so it left me feeling cold. Um,
Yeah, I agree. But I mean, not the movie overall. I thought,
yeah. Oh
it
no, no,
was
no.
a
I'm just
very
saying that particular
enjoyable,
element.
and I really liked quite a lot of the characters from the
Yeah,
first
yeah.
movie. And a complaint I had at the time was, oh my God, it's going to be another Disney franchise. You know, it's going to
Yeah.
be ruled by a committee, and probably at some point Kevin Feige is going to get involved and make it into another Marvel universe. And it's all going to feel the same, and we're going to get 3 a year, and we're going to be, you know, watching Star Wars forever and ever and ever. And
Right.
now I sit here wishing that had happened, because what actually happened was there was very little communication between anyone, it seems,
Yeah.
throughout the
Oh,
subsequent
there was.
trilogy and the satellite films that go around that
Mm-hmm.
trilogy. Are you going to say?
Yeah, no, I mean, you're exactly right. There was little or no communication between Abrams and Johnson.
Yes, yes.
And
Apparently, Johnson hadn't seen or read the script of the first movie
yeah,
when beginning filming the second one, which seems insane given the scope of what they were doing.
yeah, yeah, I'm with you 100% there. It's
As opposed to the first two trilogies, which were just basically controlled by, you know, the prequel trilogy just by one man, and the one before that by at most three people.
yeah,
They were tight. They knew the story. The continuity was very good.
hmm
Even if, you know, Lucas didn't know exactly how the third movie was going to end, it never felt jarring watching them.
yeah,
But the tone shift in from the seventh movie to the eighth movie
yeah,
was was so strange. You
It
went
was.
from A New Hope again,
Mhm.
uplifting, we've found Luke Skywalker, things are going to get better now, to almost this weird like Laurel and Hardy situation
Yeah.
where they were playing off. Then that scene where he throws the lightsaber over his shoulder
Yeah.
onto a cliff and kind of just brushes off the idea that no, the Jedi were no big deal.
Yeah.
Um, I don't know what they were thinking. I don't know why it was allowed to happen.
Yeah.
Given what Disney is known for, which is tight stories, playing it safe. Um, I mean, there are other things they're known for as well, but those are some positive things they are known for, generally speaking.
Yeah. Um, I mean, so Ryan Johnson is a very strong filmmaker, and he actually has a similar story to George Lucas. I mean, he was an independent
Yeah.
spirit,
So
a maverick.
he's known for Looper, I think. It's his science fiction time travel movie before that, which
Yeah,
received great reviews.
yeah.
Um, but also prior to that, hadn't really done anything.
Well, so his film before that, which was what got him the acclaim that allowed him to move on to Looper, and he made a movie called Brick. Have you heard of it or seen it?
I have, yes, yeah.
Okay, yeah. So Brick, I mean, was 100% independent. I mean, even to the point where he was recording the soundtrack himself using items from his kitchen uh, on a MacBook using the GarageBand app. I mean, it was as down and dirty as it could be. The closest thing to anything professional about it was him getting Joseph Gordon-Levitt, who was a decently well-known actor at the time. But other than that, it was about as independent as you can get, and yet it had this cult following. And so he was known as, between Brick and then Looper, this very capable, just pioneering filmmaker who loves to take genres. So Brick is a it's a film noir, but it's set in a high school. And then Looper, I guess, would be kind of not necessarily a film noir, but it's definitely in that mystery
Yeah, I mean,
vein.
I'd say it's sort of like a B movie, a high
Yeah,
concept, medium budget, kind of fun to watch.
yeah,
Very, very indie
um,
in
yeah. And
its
then
style.
subsequent to that, he did Knives Out, and it's got this huge ensemble cast. But if you move past that, it is a cozy mystery. So he loves genre stories, and he loves tinkering with them and finding interesting and new ways to tell them, and he's very good at it.
I mean, Hollywood
And
does do this every now and then. We get like what's not the guy that made District 9. Sheldon
oh
Cooper's the
yeah, yeah, yeah,
actor.
yeah. I know who you're talking about, but
Blomkamp, Neil Blomkamp.
mhm.
And I mean, completely unknown, but Peter Jackson, I think watched one of his like university
Yes,
movies and said, "Oh, this would be a great guy to give some money." And we get District 9, which was a pretty good film,
mhm.
and then two subsequently, maybe not so great films of his as well. But they were sort of no consequence, well, he gave him a shot, very interesting films, but we didn't ruin. Well, I mean, I don't want to say ruin because some people really like those movies, but
Yeah,
didn't sour the Star Wars storyline for a lot of people.
right.
Maybe the most financially important storyline of all time.
Right.
Um, to the point where I think Ryan Johnson cost them somewhere about around like $2 billion in revenue.
Yeah.
If you go on what the first movie earned, the
Right.
subsequent two movies earned, it's um it's an incredible misstep, and but
Yes.
it was done in a way you generally think is creatively a good idea of giving someone a chance,
Right.
someone from a sort of indie scene bringing in new fresh ideas, right? That's
Yeah.
probably how it was pitched. he's done some great work. He knows science fiction. He's very much like George Lucas was back in the day.
Mm-hmm.
J.J. Abrams. J.J. Abrams is someone who was handpicked by Steven Spielberg and said, "This is a good person to manage and do exactly what you need to continue
Yeah.
Star Wars." And
Right.
J.J. Abrams is great in that sort of role. He's a manager.
Right.
He's maybe not the most creative person in the world,
Yeah.
but he makes solid movies, and they don't go over budget, and they get done on time.
Mm-hmm.
Perfectly serviceable.
Yes, he's a solid bet. He's not going to do anything dangerous or spectacular, but it will be 100% serviceable
But here's where I
for
think
his
the problem
audience.
comes in. He loved Star Wars, J.J. Abrams.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
so he didn't want to make any more of them because he wanted to be surprised. He wanted
Right.
to feel like a child again, and experience like the wonder of a new Star Wars coming out without having made it himself, I suppose.
Right.
So he was very happy to hand it off to someone. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the issue. If he had just sort of stayed as a sort of showrunner, so to speak.
Yeah.
If you imagine a series of movies as a television series,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
bring in Ryan Johnson, have him direct the film. By all means, it was a stunningly beautiful movie, The Last Jedi.
Right.
It just needed continuity with the previous movie.
Yeah. Well,
It was like watching something from a different universe.
yeah. It flouted the whole philosophy of Star Wars up until that point. It was a cynical deconstruction and also a flippant one. It wasn't just that it was dark and gritty. It was um, very laissez-faire towards the legacy of the films that came prior. And
And
so
and I suppose at times what people complain about is it felt almost insulting
yes, yeah,
to to the people who would have enjoyed it the most if it was a more traditional kind of Star Wars movie.
yeah, yeah. And you get that right out of the gate with that infamous scene of Luke throwing the lightsaber over his shoulder. Um,
And then again
and
in that casino sequence, which is a political commentary on, I suppose, slavery and capitalism and war
right,
profiteering. There's no actual good guys, which then frames, you know, are the resistance actually good? Is the New Order actually bad? They both
right.
seem to be doing terrible things, which is actually a problem
Which
I had with Rogue One, which is the preceding movie, sort of
mhm,
adjacent movie, which sort of kind of frames the rebels as more of a radical terrorist organization.
right.
Um, and yeah, I don't know how to think about what Disney did there. But they obviously knew they did something bad, right?
Yeah.
Because they brought J.J. Abrams back to finish the trilogy. And I think they gave him a lot of leeway in what could be done there.
Yeah.
But the problem is, and anyone who's trying to write a trilogy, like sort of like Sanderson would say, you got to have a solid plan for it.
Right.
And his plan had been derailed, so
Yeah.
he had to try and put two movies worth of concepts into a short runtime,
Yeah.
and it just didn't come together as well as it should have, in my opinion.
Well, because the movies had been wrestling with each other, and so they had proposed, like you said, it was almost like watching Episode 8 was like watching a movie from an alternative universe, where
Yeah, like a Twilight Zone version of Star Wars.
yeah, they each created opposite setups, of where this story was going. And so a lot of what um, what episode 8 did was it took all the setups of the previous film and tossed them out the window and then created its own setups. And so Abrams had to figure out, how do I pay off a film that tossed out all of my setups? It wasn't, and he didn't know where his own setups were going. But like you said, I mean, he was excited to see.
But anyone who, with good faith, had read the script of that movie would have seen clear continuations of those plots.
Right.
And satisfying conclusions to them, or at least midpoints in a trilogy where they would have logically ended up.
Right, but because, oh gosh, his name slipped my mind.
Johnson doesn't seem to have had the script, or hadn't seen it, or it wasn't finalized at the time, and they had begun writing the sequel with only basic guidelines.
Right, and I think he was just so concerned with his own sort of deconstruction of upsetting the status quo, and that it was a very, I want to say, almost a disrespectful approach to the audience, to the people even to the people involved with making the film. I mean, I can't remember where I saw this, but Mark Hamill in an interview said that was not Luke Skywalker. I know Luke because I have been him.
You can see in some interviews around the thing, Mark Hamill is deeply upset by the.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so for instance, one of the things that doesn't make sense with so this is a good example of not having your characters' actions be motivated, right? Or having unclear motivations. So we know that Luke Skywalker is the ultimate idealist, right? He always, I mean, for goodness sake, he is the New Hope.
Yes. He is the person who can redeem Darth Vader.
Right, exactly. So the idea that he would give up on his nephew so easily, I mean, again, I can't remember where I saw this, but Mark Hamill said, I just don't buy it. That's not the character I played. Nor would he have such a cynical, laissez-faire approach to all of that. I mean, he almost became just this washed up, goofy old man.
Sorry, that reminds me of that green milk scene.
Yes, it was so
disrespectful
totally
to his character, to make him appear as goofy and as as you say, washed up, as all that.
Yeah, and yeah, I could go on a whole long tangent on that. I mean, there's so many things.
So yeah, just to transition. To the next bit. So the third movie, I think, wraps it up in as best the way J.J. Abrams could come up with, and it's the only Star Wars movie I've seen once, and I'm not sure if I'll eventually see it again, but I thought, okay, let's wrap it up. I'm done now. At least it didn't end as poorly as I thought. I thought it was really dumb the way they had, like, Death Star's weapons on thousands of ships, and then for some reason the ships couldn't fly. Who knows? Anyway, but he managed to tie up almost every plot line, and he managed to ignore a couple of ones that Johnson had intentionally tried to set up as well.
Yeah.
And in that sense, we got a conclusion, which I am grateful for. And no one was happy with the way that trilogy turned out. Not the people who liked the way it began, and not the people who liked Rian Johnson's interpretation of Star Wars, because the third movie didn't really continue either of those. And that's plot.
Yeah.
And people agreed that, with their wallet, that uh, by far, it was the least watched one of that series. And
Hmm.
just as a cautionary tale to authors and people who are collaborating, I mean, a trilogy is only ever going to work and grow and become more popular if you build on the ideas of the previous story. I
Right.
mean, that should be such an obvious concept, and it's just going to suffer if you don't.
Right.
But
Absolutely.
I wanted to say, at one point in the Last Jedi,
Mhm.
the ghost of Yoda shows up, which is something that is normal, I suppose, in Star Wars. But he talks about reading the old books or
Mhm.
letting them burn or something like that,
Yeah.
as he strikes holy lightning down upon some sort of Jedi library tree,
Yeah.
I guess. And that just got me thinking of all of the Star Wars books that have been written about the
Yeah.
universe and the
Oh,
expanded
yeah.
universe. And if we could talk about them for a few minutes, I'd like to just point out to people that there's a bunch of good things,
Mhm.
even in the current uh, Star Wars climate, even if you didn't like the movies, that you probably will enjoy if you're a
Right.
Star Wars fan. Are you familiar with any Star Wars books?
I'm sadly, I am fairly ignorant, and I'm worse than that. I actually, two of the authors who have mentored me and trained me are authors within that series.
Oh, who are they?
Re- Rebecca Moesta and Kevin J. Anderson.
Okay.
Um, and yeah, so I should be ashamed. I need to go read them. And I'm sure you have recommendations for which ones you feel
Yeah, no,
are best.
I'd be happy to go through. But I mean, just to talk. I mean, Star Wars had the resurgence of Star Wars in the '90s was probably due to a book series,
Hmm.
the Thrawn trilogy by Timothy Zahn. Um,
Hmm.
I don't think it's very well written, which I think a lot of people would hate me saying. But it has a very interesting character in it, Grand
Right.
Admiral Thrawn, who's sort of the replacement for the head of the Empire after everyone else is killed in the Death Star explosion.
Right.
And he's sort of this cerebral art lover, who studies tactics and does logical things and is calm and has all these great strategies, and that's why people like him. But that Timothy Zahn got his sort of break on that series. And when Disney took over, they brought him back to essentially
Hmm.
rewrite those books to fit their new canon. And
Okay.
it seems in the subsequent years, since the '80s, he's actually become like a really decent author.
Excellent.
His style is much better. His plot's solid. His characters are likable, and the dialogue's not so.
And
It's first time authory, if you know what I mean.
yeah.
And I'd really suggest people maybe looking that up if they remember any of that with nostalgia, or they just like the Star Wars universe.
Yeah. So you're saying that he kind of revisited those original stories, but with a more experienced hand this time, or did
So
he just
I mean,
continue
it
those?
was so originally they were a direct sequel to Return of the Jedi, and
Yeah.
obviously Disney left a 40-year gap
Right.
where they changed many of the things that would have happened in his
Right.
things. So yeah, he's started again, including the character of Thrawn, which is very popular, but it brought them in at a different point and worked out um, how he would have gone about business in this new timeline that
Gotcha.
Disney created,
Okay.
and they're very good. Uh,
Excellent.
I've been made fun of for reading them by some more serious people, but they're actually very decent, very well written books. Just they happen to be in the Star Wars universe.
Yeah. I mean, I totally understand that. I mean, honestly, a book that I adore, and it's not particularly well written, but the story is compelling. And honestly, from what I can tell, the story is a complete ripoff of Ender's Game. But the novelization, the first story in the novelization of the Halo video games, I mean,
Right.
it sounds so goofy and silly. But it's a book I've read at least 20 times, just because I guess the way that Eric Nyland created these characters and really kind of gave you the backstory for them and the development of the Spartan program and all that sort of stuff. It was, I don't, even reading it now, I don't mind, with the new eyes that I have to understand craft, I can let all that go, because the characters are compelling and the story that it tells is compelling. I really don't.
It's almost a gift to have that sort of universal structure to adhere to for an author, because it limits
Yeah,
you and you can really focus on the characters.
absolutely.
Sorry, the author of Timothy Zahn, he also, I think might be influential in the current incarnation of the Guardians of the Galaxies, that
Okay.
movies that we have, because I think he wrote some of the comic books that they were based on, not the current
Okay.
printings that Marvel has, which whatever, sort of the 90s, early 2000s um, ones. He had some influence in, like, specifically I think the Star-Lord character, or at least around there. I think. But he didn't write the entire series, but he wrote a few of them.
Okay.
So
Well,
if you like that kind of weird, I don't know, quirky
yeah.
style, you probably like most of the things he's written.
Okay. And I
Uh,
mean, that explains why Guardians of the Galaxy has such a. I mean, to me, it has almost a Star Wars feel to it. It does feel like
yes,
a space opera.
yeah. I mean, it certainly feels like the new Star Wars, especially when it
Hmm.
came out, which was before the new Star Wars came out. In addition to that, there's a author called James Lucena,
Hmm.
who sort of writes these, at least in the Star Wars universe, writes these character profiles of characters from the thing. So he's got a book about Tarkin, which you barely see him in the first movie. He's the commander of the Death Star who blows up with it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he writes his entire history, explains why he's this strict military man, explains his psychological profile and his bizarre sort of family history, and how he ended up commanding the most powerful weapon in the galaxy. Very
Yeah.
interesting. It's almost like an old World War II story or something like that, but maybe
Yeah.
of a Nazi character or something like that.
Fascinating.
And then he wrote another one called Darth Plagueis,
Hmm.
who was Emperor Palpatine's master.
Right.
You hear in one of the prequels, I think, third one,
Yes.
uh, Palpatine talk about him briefly. Had learned how to revive people from death and all that sort of thing.
Hmm.
And it's a political drama about how Palpatine and Plagueis take over the government of the Republic,
Right.
and it's very interesting. Uh, and I think a lot of it would have been the basis of a new George Lucas version of a sequel
Right.
trilogy. I think even originally with J.J. Abrams, there was some intention to bring that character back as to reveal, oh, that was just Snoke. Snoke
Yeah.
was Darth Plagueis. That's
Well, and that certainly seemed to be what it had. I mean, what he was setting up. I mean, I remember when I did go back and rewatch the original trilogy. That was my first thought on hearing Palpatine, Senator Palpatine, give his backstory with Plagueis. I was like, oh, that's probably who Snoke was meant to be initially. Um, and so, I mean, that makes so much more sense, and I wish that they had pursued that, rather than have him
yeah.
be this throwaway character.
I mean, the way I understand it, though, sadly, is that they intended something like that,
Yeah.
but they unfortunately settled on Palpatine as a more viable brand name. to bring
Right.
back in the last movie, after the Last Jedi's.
Yeah. I'll be honest, I never really fully understood, even after having seen all three movies, what Snoke was meant to be. If he was a clone of, like a failed clone among many clones of
So
Palpatine, or if he was just a puppet, or.
yeah, I mean, in the novelization, there's a throwaway line that says Palpatine used Darth Vader's cloning technology to make Snoke, but
Okay.
that's all we ever get.
Interesting.
But moving on to I just want to point out an author called Claudia Gray. And
Hmm.
she's a young adult writer. She's written something called the Evernight series, Spellcaster series, Firebird series, and some Star Wars books. One called Lost Stars, one called Bloodline. And Lost Stars in particular is just an excellent young adult book. It's about these two children who join the Imperial Starfleet.
Hmm.
Um, and one of them goes on to be a captain of a Star Destroyer, and one of them sort of goes on to be a rebel, like Marine, I guess.
Yeah.
And it's just this wonderful like Romeo and Juliet story set in the Star Wars universe. Um,
Sounds fantastic.
and it happens during the course of the first trilogy. So the Empire's new, they're young, they join up, one gets disillusioned, joins the rebellion, one, becomes a good Imperial officer and gets promoted again and again and again. But, ultimately ends up with this kind of almost Romeo and Juliet tragedy. I don't think they die at the end of the book. But,
Right.
they're forced to fight, sort of.
Of course.
And it's just such an excellent little side story that happened in this um, little enclave of literature which no one is ever going to read, because honestly, who reads these books except for me and a few
Well, I
people like
mean,
me?
yeah, I mean, I've definitely met many people. I think this is one of those instances where a small, devoted fan base is really all you need. Um, because whereas people may not, it may not spread, it may not become anything that's a widespread hit, but the authors and the publishers know that the small fan base they have is dedicated, and they will buy pretty much every subsequent book in the series. I'm sure of at least of the authors that they know and admire. Or that sort of that branding and consistency is something that audiences look forward to. I mean, there's kind of a parallel in the world of video games. There's a video game called Shadow of the Colossus, and it's not a very well known game. It's not a game that puts up great numbers, but it's been remade 3 or 4 times for each subsequent generation of systems, because people like me who are so dedicated to it will buy every iteration of it.
And people
and
people love that game, and it has a specific cult following,
Right.
and they should be thrilled with it, because it is an interesting take on just the genre in general.
Yeah.
Something.
And I was just going to say, I think it's kind of the same thing there. Yeah.
Yeah, no, you're right. And something I just want to point out, right? So Del Rey is the publisher for Star Wars books. Disney has their
Hmm.
own press. Disney Lucasfilm Press is what they use to publish their Star Wars books.
Right.
And I just caution people when reading, especially the new Star Wars books, is that if it is from Disney Lucasfilm, it's essentially propaganda for an upcoming movie.
Okay.
Whereas the Del Rey books will contain a whole story, generally
Right.
speaking. So just go in knowing that, I suppose.
Right.
Um, which is unfortunate, because Claudia Gray has done work with both of them, and
Right.
it's evident the one was her story and the other one was a writer's room or some sort of story team dictating, we need a Princess Leia book, so go and
Yeah,
write that, that sort of thing.
right.
But I
Yeah.
mean, it's interesting how how many books have been written in the Star Wars universe. I think there's well over 200.
Wow.
Many of them cherished by people. Many
Hmm.
people very upset that Disney threw out a lot of the old books to give way to the new universe. Threw out per se, but made non-canon, as people would say. But that shouldn't matter when you're reading a good book, as long as it's a self-contained and good story. I
Absolutely.
wouldn't just encourage people not to let that upset them too much.
No, not at all.
So some final
No,
thoughts, I guess.
yeah, shoot.
So Star Wars is an amazing narrative
Hmm.
and has clearly captivated the minds of generations of people. And maybe up until the Marvel Universe was probably the most successful franchise of all time, I would say. I
Hmm.
don't know if you'd agree with that.
I would, absolutely. Yeah.
And it became very, very important to people. Uh, I think I'd encourage people to watch the movie Fanboys to sort of grasp how important to some people.
Yeah.
And if you ever find yourself in charge of something like that, I just encourage you to take it seriously because it is sometimes some of the only comfort some people have in their lives.
Sure.
You hear stories of dying children who got to see uh, the movie early,
Right.
just before they passed away, or people are going through a really tough time and can't really cope very well. I mean, the world's a tough place, and sometimes fiction is the last resort. And if you manage to build something as comforting, as reassuring as this story of good and evil, it's almost irresponsible to go anywhere else with it.
Right.
Is my general feeling. And I hate that I think that, because I generally think an author is free to do whatever they want. But as a member of society, I just encourage people to consider the people around them and and just be conscious of the the zeitgeist of your fan base when you do make that sequel that's a bit too edgy.
Well, just to kind of build on that, the actor who played Obi-Wan Kenobi in the original films, um, his name is escaping me at the moment. I'm terrible about that. Um, I'm trying to look him up now. What's that?
No, no, Ewan McGregor's uncle. How do I remember? Alec Guinness.
uh,
Alec Guinness.
Alec Guinness. That's right. So Alec Guinness, he was the only known actor in the original trilogy. Everybody else was a fresh face. They were unknown, and they brought
Harrison
him
Ford was a
on.
carpenter
Yep.
before this.
Yeah, and his only real role had been in Lucas's previous film, American Graffiti. It was not a huge thing, and he wasn't even actually allowed to be. He was only there to feed people lines. He was meant to be. Anyway, that's a little side thing. It was kind of dumb luck that he was brought in to actually become that character, because he and Mark Hamill actually ended up having such great chemistry together when they were reading. But so Alec Guinness, he Mark Hamill asked him, he said, "Why on earth are you doing this movie?" And I mean, you have all this clout. You're a brilliant character actor. You've done 25, 30 films. This
And
is a
and he
children's
he he
movie.
never he never once watched a Star Wars movie.
Yeah. Uh, and he said, this is a children's movie. Why are you interested? And Alec Guinness said, well, I love fairy tales and I love stories that clearly delineate good versus evil. I think this is something that is absolutely necessary, especially right now when we have an era of such incredible cynicism in cinema. So he saw it as a moral imperative. Honestly, he felt like he needed to be involved with this, regardless of whatever kind of social cachet it could afford him, or clout, or any of those sorts of things. It was something that he felt like he needed to join this project and aid it as best he could, because it was a story that needed to be told, and a perspective that needed to be revisited and reinvigorated. And so,
yeah, no, it's a deeply important point, because I mean, it's sort of how we raise our children, isn't it? We can sit them in front of a screen and let the sort of morals sink in, and you hope that they want to be, at the very worst, Han Solo, but if preferably Luke Skywalker, and you don't want them to want to be Kylo Ren, really, do you?
No, probably not. Although, I mean, I will say, I think they did some interesting things with Kylo Ren in the long run. But no, you're right. You want to present characters who, not necessarily are morally ambiguous, but who stand for something. And I think that's what's fantastic about Luke Skywalker. He's not a character who really evolves. He just becomes more himself. Over time he becomes more. At least in the original series, he doesn't become cynical. He doesn't change, but he does grow. So he's kind of this character that's similar to Captain America or Superman, who has it right and stands his ground, and he's not changed by the world necessarily. He changes the world, and I think that's an important thing for all people, but especially children, to see.
I couldn't agree more. And yeah, I think that'll do it for our Star Wars podcast. I'm not sure if we'll call it a special edition. But thank you all for watching. Sorry, if you're on YouTube, and thank you all for listening. If you're listening to this on the Writer's Right page, please like and subscribe to our YouTube channel, and please comment on Writer's Right if you agree with anything we said today. I'm Christopher Dean. You can find me on Twitter at Christopher Luke Dean, and my co-host is.
I'm Oliver Fox. You can find my articles on writersright.co.za.
Thank you very much.